Well, hi everyone, and welcome to another edition of Adam's Music Box. And it was on this week in 1973 when the second and final official studio album from the Mahavishnu Orchestra was released. As you can see behind me, it was called Birds of Fire. 2 years earlier, their debut album, The Inner Mounting Flame, came out, and collectively, those two original Mahavishnu Orchestra albums changed several genres all at once, and it even changed the perception of music, not just among the public, but among many fellow musicians. To say that these albums were incredibly significant in music history would be an understatement. So let's try to understand why. Mahavishnu Orchestra was John McLaughlin's band, and it was McLaughlin himself who said all forms of music are ultimately fusion, because all creativity necessarily, in McLaughlin's view, involves combining various traditions and various inspirations to create something new and something novel and something interesting. And he certainly did that with his fellow Mahavishnu Orchestra members. Beyond that, we have to understand the context in which the band was formed. While the Mahavishnu Orchestra's first albums aren't necessarily the first fusion albums, they were really the first to become absolutely stratospheric, comparatively, of course. Earlier, we had Bitches Brew, which members of the Mahavishnu Orchestra played a part in, the double Miles Davis album, where he went fully electric after easing his way into it in the few albums that came before that. And it was also in 1969 that Tony Williams released what in many ways is one of the most profound fusion albums of all time, Emergency. And that featured, of course, Tony Williams on drums, quite possibly the finest drummer of all time, featured Larry Young on organ, and he played the Hammond organ in ways that it had literally never been played before, arguably never since. And on guitar was, of course, John McLaughlin himself. Just recently, footage thought to be lost forever of the Tony Williams lifetime was released on the Beat Club YouTube channel. And this footage shows that some of the early Mahavishnu Orchestra songs were surprisingly complete even in the lifetime years. They were playing it live. This was the second lineup of the short-lived Tony Williams lifetime, the first edition of Lifetime. And that was, of course, Tony on the drums, John McLaughlin on guitar, Larry Young on organ, and the addition of Jack Bruce on electric bass and vocals, Jack Bruce from Cream, of course. And they released an album with that lineup called Turn It Over, really, really good as well. But while Emergency and Turn It Over were very gritty, very dark, and very much improvisational at their core, Mahavishnu Orchestra, as the name might apply, was very much about complex orchestrations from which the band members then went wild on with improvisational solos, and all of that was captured beautifully well on these first albums, which had a much brighter, tighter sound than the Tony Williams lifetime. I love them both, but there was no doubt that the sound of the Mahavishnu Orchestra, because of that brighter, tighter feel, was more commercial. And for jazz fusion, which in recent years has sort of been relegated to jazz clubs, people releasing their own materials on Spotify and elsewhere, these albums sold big. Both Inner Mounting Flame and Birds of Fire were in the US top 20, and they also sold very well in Europe and beyond. One of the most interesting things about Mahavishnu Orchestra is that it really struck a very fine balance between order and chaos. Their unison or tutti sections had to be so precise or the whole thing would fall apart. And because of the intensity of the playing, it did feel at times like it was maybe only a few beats away from falling completely apart, but it never did. The solos were otherworldly. Now, the first Mahavishnu lineup was, of course, John McLaughlin on guitar, Jon Hammer on keyboards, including synthesizer, the great Billy Cobham on drums, Jerry Goodman on violin, and Rick Layard on the bass. Now, People often wonder why this band was so short-lived. They were incredibly successful. They really took the fusion genre into the mainstream. They were sharing bills with major rock bands. They shared the bill with ZZ Top, with Alice Cooper, with Yes, with Frank Zappa. Not exactly rock in his own words, but in his own words, music consumed by rock audiences. They even shared the bill with people like Harry Chapin. So they were definitely in that rock pop sort of genre in terms of the people who consumed their music. If you went to a record store when Mahavishnu Orchestra was new, you would more likely than not find the record sitting in the rock section rather than the jazz section. And that's generally true even today if you were to look for a Mahavishnu Orchestra album. And that's less to do with the style of the music and more to do with the fact that it was consumed by rock audiences as well as jazz audiences, but rock audiences then, as after, were larger in number than jazz audiences. Another reason is that, apart from the drums, obviously, they were fully electric. They were a very, very loud band. Even by the standards of heavy rock bands of the day. If you put Mahavishnu Orchestra on a bill with, let's say, Uriah Heep, Black Sabbath, The Deep Purple, the volume would have been as intense and at times more. Now, the reason that this original lineup of Mahavishnu broke up was because of disputes over writing credits. And this itself speaks to one of the issues between jazz and rock and one of the differences. So, in rock bands, generally, the people who contribute to the writing, to the composition, tend to get a writing credit. In jazz, it works traditionally a bit differently. The person who writes the song's head, meaning the part of the song where the melody and chords are introduced at the beginning, this person typically gets full writing credits, and the other people in the band contributing to the solo and the spontaneous arrangement do not get writing credits. This has always been controversial. And because Mahavishnu Orchestra tended to be, again, put by the public and by the record label in the rock genre, the other members of the band got upset because they felt that their contributions to the arrangement and their solos should have counted towards a writing credit. And this led to the band's breakup. But Mahavishnu came back very quickly because John McLaughlin put together Mahavishnu Orchestra 2.0, another incredibly talented band that sometimes, unfortunately, overlooked because of the explosiveness of the first lineup. This featured Narada Michael Walden on drums, a great drummer who then became a great solo artist in both the fusions and soul and neo R&B genres. He became a very important producer, especially on the Whitney Houston records that he produced. He was the drummer, though, for the second Mahavishnu Orchestra. Jean-Luc Ponty, a man who was already quite famous as a jazz violinist in his own right by then, very famous indeed, joined on violin. Ralph Armstrong, a very young bass player, was playing fretless electric bass. Chick Corea's beautiful wife, Gail Moran, on keyboards and occasionally vocals. And on the first album of that lineup, they even played with the London Symphony Orchestra, conducted by Michael Tilson Thomas, and an album that fused not only jazz and rock, but also modern orchestral. And it worked very well. It was produced by George Martin of Beatles fame, and taking it on the road was sometimes difficult. They didn't tour with the full orchestra, but they did bring a small string section and some extra brass, and there are quite a few bootlegs of that lineup playing live at the Montreux Jazz Festival. The sound balance, at least at that performance, between the strings, brass, and band it wasn't perfect, but when the band played on its own or when they overpowered the others, you can tell that they were just as tight and just as stratospheric, really, as the first lineup. Of course, if more time was taken to achieve a better sound balance, perhaps coming up with some novel monitoring solutions, there would have been no reason that the whole thing couldn't have been taken on the road. But hey, it is what it is. Live music is a game of time and numbers. That same lineup, minus the orchestra, did another album called Visions of the Emerald Beyond. And that was tight, beautiful, very rocky, very psychedelic, but still very jazzy. Jean-Luc Ponty left after that, as did Gail Moran, to be replaced by the great jazz keyboardist Stu Goldberg, and they released Inner Worlds, the final album of the first run of the second lineup of Mahavishnu Orchestra. Now, John McLaughlin would resurrect the name a few other times in the 80s with unrelated bands playing a somewhat more restrained version of jazz rock fusion, still very, very good, but it was really these 70s bands, Mahavishnu 1 and Mahavishnu 2, and there was sort of Mahavishnu 3 with Inner Worlds, but that was largely the same lineup as 2 in many ways. And those albums were really all classics, even though it was the first two with the original lineup that really, really went sky high. Phil Collins, for instance, a much, much better drummer than he's given credit for. Not that he isn't among drummers, but among the public, he's probably best known for his solo work or when he became the vocalist of Genesis. But long before that, when he was just the drummer for Genesis, he said that he was so inspired by Billy Cobham's playing in Mahavishnu and the whole Mahavishnu sound that he wanted to bring in ever more sort of complex, odd time signatures and syncopation into Genesis. They were so very influential on musicians. No musician worth his salt at the time didn't hear of them. One of their final tours was, of course, with another fusion legend who started off very much in the rock and roll world, but became a fusion legend, and this was Jeff Beck. Some bootlegs of those shows that featured both the Jeff Beck band and Mahavishnu circulate online, and there were even some crossovers because Jan Hammer played with the original Mahavishnu Orchestra, and he also played with Jeff Beck. Narada Michael Walton played with both as well, so there's some synergy there. John McLaughlin, of course, has had a very wide and varied solo career. He's still going strong. But Mahavishnu Orchestra was probably his closest flirtation with the mainstream, considering jazz isn't always a mainstream genre. I can't emphasize enough just how popular these albums were. Hard rock fans bought them, prog rock fans bought them, general pop fans bought them. And taking a listen, you can see why. They were recorded really well, and that allows you to hear the intricacies of the interplay between the various instruments on the album. Some might argue that if you were to remix it and really space out the stems, you could hear it even better, but you might lose some of that analog warmth that you had in the original mix. No plans to do a remix of any Mahavishnu album are on the card so far as I know, but they don't really need it. They sound really good. So for those who haven't heard of the band, definitely check them out. And for those who have, why not put them on your record player today? There's never a good reason not to. Like, subscribe, and stay tuned for more. Bye, everyone.